You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, who's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
All right. And this is one we talked about a week or so ago, where the nun is above the line.
Yeah,
and so they're
in the text, yeah.
Yeah, so in Judges 18:30, it says, the sons of Dan set up for themselves graven images, or a graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and he and his sons were priests of the tribe of Danites until this day of the captivity of the land.
Yeah.
And we know that this is put in there, and it's above the line. So it's really supposed to say Moses.
Yeah.
But the nun is above the line, so it makes it Manasseh.
Yeah.
And that really doesn't work because Manasseh, I assume it's the king Manasseh, who's the most wicked king of all Israel, and that's going to be like 700 years, probably even more than that, years later.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
Yeah.
So I assume it was it even tells us in the text that
because it's out of place in a way.
Yeah.
That the noon is in a different position, basically, on a line.
And in the notes of the Masorah, it actually tells us that this was put in by the scribes.
Right.
And Courtney had a question that I thought was really good before
Producer
we started.
Courtney, yeah.
What was that question again, Courtney?
If the scribes made a change to avoid embarrassment, why would they include a note that keeps record of what that embarrassing part is?
Yeah. And partially, I think, maybe it's to also remind them. I was thinking about this. They also have what's called a perpetual chore, which we're going to see later. It's the vowel points of the word Adonai, Lord, are put on the word, the tetragrammaton, meaning Yahweh.
Yeah.
And so they put those on to help pronounce it. But every time you see that, you know you're not supposed to say the name for God. You're supposed to say the Lord.
Right.
Well, maybe this is that kind of same thing, is to remind them this is a thing you need to think about. Here's a son of Moses that's setting up idols, and you certainly don't want to have that. It'd be more like a son of Manasseh.
Right.
So maybe it's to even do something like that to remind them all the time.
Yeah. Not even just wordplay, but it's more of like you're noting there's an important meaning to this. This is a critical thing to know.
That was a better answer than I have for earlier, wasn't it?
That was good. But I think we've hinted around it. This is another episode we're going to do on textual criticism, specifically in the Old Testament.
Yes.
So we talked about textual criticism previously, and we kind of looked at the whole Bible. There's a lot of good examples you had in the New Testament, but I think this week we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically textual criticism in the Old Testament, maybe what's different principles you may apply, different ways to think about it.
And there's some things that actually overlap. That's why that's why we're even reminding you of that other podcast. But there are some things that are unique and different, and that's what we want to talk about this week.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, so that's our word for the day.
Yeah.
And here's what it looks like in the text. This is the Codex Leningradensis. That's the oldest text that we have for our modern Hebrew Bibles.
Yeah.
And here's basically what it would look like. So son of Moses would be normal here.
Yeah.
And then son of Manasseh has that nun, but notice it's up above the line.
Significantly.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think someone who's not even familiar with reading Hebrew would notice that this is out of place in a way.
Yeah. Look at the ESV actually says the son of Moses, where the NASB actually says the son of Manasseh.
That's an interesting translation choice, isn't it?
But here's the reason why.
Yeah.
The NASB is trying to do it as literal as possible to what that text actually has. The ESV is actually going ahead and saying, we know it's a change, so why don't we just go ahead and fix it?
Right.
And so it's the difference in translation principles that they do that.
And I'm sure both would note it.
Yeah.
This is how it appears in the text, basically, and probably what it means.
Yeah. So I thought that was helpful.
That's interesting.
Okay, so here's the common question. Is the Old Testament accurate? And the answer is definitely yes.
Yeah.
Okay. The transmission histories is significantly different between the two texts, though.
Sure,
The Greek text was made in about 50 years. The Hebrew text was made over 1,000 years, and maybe even a little more than that.
Meaning being written originally.
Yeah, and some of it could have been oral tradition way before that and stuff. So you can see why even the time period is so much different.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, then they're both going to be hand copied for over 1,000 years because the printing press didn't develop till about 1550 with Gutenberg, and by that time these texts have already been hand copied for an awful long time.
Right.
So that's, I think, helpful for us to understand.
Yeah.
For much of the Old Testament history, a specialized group of scribes were set aside to maintain the text. These scribes copied scripture, and when they began to show signs of wear, like remember the last time we saw the script, that
actual scroll
that we had, and there's ink kind of falling off it and stuff.
The flakes, yeah.
Yeah, so if it shows signs of wear, the ink falling off or a rip or something like that, they would, sometimes they could fix them, sometimes they couldn't, and it was just time to get a new scroll.
Yeah.
Okay. Thus, there were fewer copies of Scripture, but the ones that they had were generally of a higher quality because you only had a specific kind of people that could actually copy them. Where the Greek text, that was not the case, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but the ones we have are generally higher than the New Testament, and Qumran has about 400 biblical manuscripts dating from maybe 350 BC all the way to 100 AD.
Wow.
So that actually, now that's why when Qumran came out, it was such an amazing
Oh,
event.
yeah.
Because it now meant that, like, we had Codex Leningradensis, but that's like 1,000 years old. It's 1,000 AD.
Right.
This one now is almost 1,000 years earlier.
Yeah.
So
and
you can
in
see.
those manuscripts, there's a ton of the Bible basically represented in there, right?
Yeah. I was putting up there. There's like 400 manuscripts, but now fragments. Even though there's only 400 manuscripts, a lot of them were fragmentary form. So, so those are hard to know exactly.
Like where they were
And
or
how
whatever.
how they come, which scroll they come from. Are they really?
sure, yeah.
But that's our guess anyway.
Yeah.
So, all right. New Testament manuscripts were copied by people of specific churches and sent copies to other churches around them.
Yeah.
Largely,
The letters.
Yeah, professional scribes were expensive, and Christian church usually was under persecution. So, so to get a manuscript copied would be almost impossible for a real professional scribe to do it. But Christians could do it. Thus the job of copying Scripture fell to anyone who had a desire to copy some. Okay. Thus, there were more copies of the New Testament, but generally of lesser quality, because anybody could do it.
Yeah.
So does that make sense? So first of all, the time period makes it a lot different, but then the quality is a lot different because we had people that were trained to copy them doing the Old Testament, where you had the New Testament, anybody could do it.
Well, and it's just a different kind of set of circumstances, really.
Exactly.
I mean, on the one side, across 50 years, like you're going to have a lot more commonality in language.
Sure.
How much did the Hebrew language develop over the period of it being written,
Yeah.
But even past that, it's a different kind of, it's a totally different kind of thinking, I think, when you're assessing this, when you have hundreds, maybe copies of something that are slightly different.
Yeah.
But like it's going to be, you can get different information from that. They can be really helpful. You know, because you have so many versions of it. You can really dial in why is this a little change here? Why is that? But it's totally different when you have when you look at the Old Testament, where maybe you have fewer, but obviously very, very precise. I mean, that was a huge value.
That was their job. Yeah.
Yeah. Like this is going to be very, very good.
Yeah. I put this picture up here that's called the Poor Man's Bible. It's a piece of pottery, and this is probably the only part that this guy had, but it was his part of the manuscript. He copied it himself probably, and it's the part of Scripture he had. Yeah. So it's kind of neat.
Yeah. So that's probably like handheld size kind of, right?
Yeah.
Wow. That's cool. Maybe we get 8 lines of text or something like that. So it's kind of like a little paragraph or something.
Yeah, but that was what he had. So I thought that's kind of neat. All right, textual criticism is the science and art that seeks to determine the most reliable reading of the text. See, that is the same definition we had for the New Testament. So that
same
part,
goals.
Doesn't change. We're trying to find about the same stuff. Problem is, here, this is a different one than we had before. This is Codex Aleppo, which is now, at least for now, the next one I think they want to use to make the new Hebrew text out of.
Really?
Yeah. And then I was telling you earlier, there's now this new one that's Codex Sassoon or something like that, and it's dated supposedly even earlier than this, or at least about the same age.
Wow.
Yeah. So that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so here's an example. In 1 Samuel 6:19, It says, and he struck some of the men of Bethshem. He's just talking about God doing this because they looked into the ark of the Lord. He struck down all the people, 50,070 men. And the people mourned because the Lord had struck them down. The NSB doesn't have any footnote because remember their goal is just to just do exactly what as literally as they can what the Codex Lenin-Credensis says.
Yeah.
And the NIV says 70 men. And then there's a note, a few Hebrew manuscripts, mostly Hebrew and Septuagint, have 50 and 70,000.
Yeah.
Okay?
50,000 and 70.
Yeah, sorry. And then the NLT, 70 men in the text, and then the note is, as in a few Hebrew manuscripts, but most of the Hebrew manuscripts and Greek versions read 50,000 and 70. Perhaps the text should be understood to read the Lord killed 70 men and 50 oxen. Now, you're probably wondering, what are you doing on there?
Yeah.
Hang on a minute. Let's look at the next one. The new RSV says 70 men, and then the note, Hebrew killed 70 men and 50,000 men. So, and that's kind of how the Hebrew works. They usually add them up.
Oh, You use kind of big whole numbers.
Yeah, and they add them together.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what's happening. Here's the Hebrew up there, and the word aleph. Let's see. It starts over here, and the people, and he struck down the people, 70 men and 50,000 men. So do you see that second to last word is thousand?
Yeah.
It's here in the yellow. That actual word can actually mean thousand or bulls. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's how that translation got in there.
Yeah.
In that, so could it be 50 men and 70?
Right. Oxen or
oxen
whatever.
kind of things. Yeah. So it's interesting. I still think it's probably 50,000 and 70 men. There's where Beth Shemesh is, and it's in kind of a valley. I got a picture here. So I'm wondering if people were standing, because this is the Ark of the Lord coming back, right?
Yeah.
So I would have thought, coming back from the Philistines, I would have thought that people would have wanted to see that.
It. You're right.
So maybe they're lined up on those hills, and then they opened it up to see if there's anything in it, and they were all watching, and God struck them down. So I still, you would have thought that if because obviously everyone knows that's a lot of people to die, right?
Yeah.
So it's an issue of, okay, why would the scribes maintain that text if everybody was thinking, man, that's way too many people?
Sure, yeah.
So it seemed like to me they kept it for a reason and left it in there.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty much thinking it's probably what it's supposed to be, but that people were lined up and could see it, and a lot of people died that day.
Yeah.
So that's my guess. It's a tough one, but
That's complicated.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of what we're getting into a little bit here, right? Because there's a lot of complications.
Yes.
When you're translating a text.
Yeah.
Right.
Now that's true even when you're just doing the translation, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got different principles on how to do a text and stuff like that. But imagine when now you've got an issue that may have come into the text and it might be corrupt or different.
Right.
So that makes it even a lot harder.
Yeah, you're even thinking about how people understood it originally, how they probably would have read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's what James Dwyer says. With a non-uniform text, that's like what's the New Testament means that they haven't just been copied like scribes.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Scribes copied them right down and followed, basically it's uniform because this one scribe copied it, next scribe copied it, the same text, hopefully. Textual criticism starts with an examination of the variant readings, even if all of them make sense. Right.
Sure.
So if you've got all these different manuscripts and you have all these several variants in there, well, you're going to start with those variants, right? You're not going to make up stuff. So you're going to assume that these are the possibilities, and you're going to see which one is the most accurate.
Yeah.
Or hopefully the most original.
Yeah.
All right. With a highly uniform text, which is what the Hebrew Bible is, because scribes maintaining it, textual criticism starts from the feeling that there's a difficulty in the text. So it's a lot more subjective.
Sure, yeah. Because it would be common across all these.
Yeah. Like you just saw that one right before that. 50,070 seems like an awful lot of people dying. So is there an issue there or not? And so it makes sense that in the Hebrew Bible, you've got a lot more subjectivity on this.
Yeah.
We still use the same kind of things. We still go to the various versions, and we go to the Hebrew manuscripts. So we basically still do the same kind of thing. But a lot of times the Hebrew manuscripts all say the same thing.
Right.
So you have to then go to a version that, like the Septuagint, that may have a different reading, or a Latin Vulgate that has a different reading.
Yeah.
So that's the logic that at least
And
we're
you would
thinking
look
about.
at that basically to see how people potentially understood it at that time.
Yes.
Right? Like if you're translating into Latin, you may have to, find more specific word or
Yeah.
whatever kind of translation step you're taking.
Yeah.
You kind of get an indication of what their thought was behind that.
Yeah,
Is that right?
and realize they're doing it. Not only they're taking a Hebrew a word, trying to translate it into a totally different language, right?
Yeah.
So that could have an issue all by itself.
Sure, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why it is kind of complicated sometimes, and you have
Yeah.
to be really careful, I think.
Yeah, sure.
So, all right. Goal of textual criticism. There are no autographs of the Old or New Testament. We've already talked about that. Thus, the task of a textual critic is to get back as close as possible to the original autographs. The problem in the Hebrew text is it's hard to know. I've got on here. It's hard to know when the composition stopped and when transmission started, because remember, I'm very conservative, so I don't believe like JDP theory and all those that came together. But even in places where we've got things added to the text, we've got one in Genesis 14:14 where the name Dan was added into the text because at that point the name the city Dan wasn't called Dan yet.
Right.
So, and we know that from the biblical text itself.
Right.
So at some point, some copyists put that in.
Yeah.
So is that considered him transmitting the text, or is he actually now doing some composition of it still?
Right.
And so that's why it's difficult. Even if there's little things that are changed, the question then is, when did composition stop?
Right.
And textual criticism started, or transmission started.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
it's a fuzzy.
Yeah, that's why
line.
it's so a composition is the actual putting together of the text.
Yeah.
And then transmission is the copying process.
Right.
So you don't really have that issue, at least I don't think, in the New Testament, because it was such a short history.
Sure. Yeah.
There's probably some question as to whether Paul wrote all of the books that he did, but it seems like to me, even if that's true, and I don't think it is, but even if it's true, that's a small portion of time, 50 years at max.
Yeah.
You don't have things like in the or the Old Testament where they're still adding maybe several years later.
Yeah, generations potentially even.
Yeah. That name for Dan, that's got to be it's got to be 700 years at least after its name changed, and it says that before it changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, for a textual critic, with these kind of two categories of composition and transmission,
Yeah.
the idea would be to get back to the original composition, but part of the task is also tracking transmission.
Sure.
Essentially, right?
Yeah.
Would that be part of it?
Yeah. But composition is I would think would be the hardest.
Primary.
When does
that's
it,
your goal.
Yeah. When does it stop so that we can say this is the autograph?
Yeah.
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 So I just wanted you to realize how complicated this is. All right. Remember the structure of the book of Isaiah? It had those 3 introductions, remember?
Yeah.
And I've got them here. But that is giving you some indication that initially it might have been given in parts, and at some point it's put together.
Right.
And then it's got those 3 refrains.
Yeah.
These are suggesting that there's now a structure.
Right.
But when Isaiah was giving these oracles, he didn't have that kind of structure. It was only when it gets recorded. So that's why composition is kind of a touchy thing. It's kind of difficult at times.
Sure, yeah. Because I'd say, especially not just to plug the previous podcast, the Isaiah podcast, but a lot of what we talked about, it's a very structured
book.
Like it would be hard to do that in one draft, probably. Like a lot of thought went into building this to kind of make it a very organized and sensible piece, a complete piece, really, you know.
And remember, initially, it was probably given orally.
Right.
To
Over
the-
a very, what was the timeline?
Remember 60 years,
I think,
yeah.
right? Oh, I did
Yeah.
remember that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but like, again, same thing. It's a very long time.
Yeah.
You know, that's longer than we think the New Testament was written.
Yeah, yeah.
Even, you know. So to be put together, that's a very fascinating process. But yeah, that's a tough question, I think, even there, right?
Yep. Yeah. So these messages were recorded, and then at some point they're put together.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking for, that composition. When were they actually
Yeah.
put into a book?
Right.
And sometimes it's difficult.
Yeah.
I've got two examples. That Genesis 14, 14 is the one where Dan is mentioned before it was
it
ever called
exists.
Dan.
Right.
Dan.
Right.
But Isaiah 7:8 also has another one. It says, "Now in another 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, so there's no longer a people." Well, when was that added? Because it would seem like to me, Ahaz could care less of what's going to happen in 65 years.
Yeah, right.
He's worried about the kings that are on his northern border, what's going to happen tomorrow when they
Right.
attack us.
Right.
So I actually, now remember, I told you at that point, this is all true because 65 years later, Esarhaddon does come through
Right.
and deports more people.
Yeah.
But so when did it become the composition? When was it finished?
Yeah.
When that phrase was added into it? Because almost all the manuscripts that we know have it in there.
Yeah.
But obviously, I don't think initially it did.
Yeah.
So our goal, so the question is, when did it stop composition and when did transmission start?
Yeah.
And that's final composition is what we're looking for.
Right.
But I think sometimes we can actually get back before that. Like in this case, I think we can get back before that phrase was added, and that was initially what the original text was. So I call it a pre-Masoretic text. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So it's sometime before the present text we have now.
Yeah.
And remember, these are translations of a Hebrew Bible
Right.
that's called the Masoretic text.
Yeah.
And the Masoretes maintain that.
Yeah.
So once they've maintained a text and they're copying it down for us, we can actually get, I think, back before
Right.
that.
Yeah.
So
Just by looking at the text, essentially.
yeah,
Yeah.
and trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all right. There was also there's something called the fluidity of the Old Testament text. And that the reason I even bring this up is that sometimes people would modify, they're called matras lectiones. And I'm sorry about that, but it means mothers of reading. and what that is that's a consonant that's put in to represent a vowel. And we actually know that the matras lectiones were added well into, like, we actually, when we look at the MT text, the Hebrew MT, the Masoretic text, it's got less of these matras lectiones in
wow.
them than the Qumran does. Qumran has actually more.
Really?
Yeah. So what's happening is these consonants were added to help the people know what vowel was there.
Right.
But they were added even into the first century.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what that fluidity of the text is, and that's why it makes it so complicated.
Yeah.
So here's these people adding even these little things like a matras lectionis into the text.
Yeah.
Well, then is that still composition or is that transmission
Right.
at that point?
Right.
So-
yeah, and it's a little bit of, it kind of could fit in both
Yeah.
categories because it doesn't seem like they're trying to change meaning. It seems like they're trying to
help,
define it. Yeah, help
Yeah.
it, be clearer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is
It's a modification of that.
change, yeah.
We do know that at about 100 AD, I've given you some examples here, like a hey can stand for an A vowel. A yod can stand for an E or an I.
Yeah.
Because those are the vowels that are made out
Yeah.
of those consonants. So there does, in Hebrew, that all makes sense to them.
Right.
And so to add these consonants, it's a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah.
But the question is, okay, so they're adding these in, so that still has a fluid text, even if there are little
Yeah.
minor changes.
Sure, yeah.
And then at about 100 AD, for some reason, all the manuscripts that we found after that do not have any changes. So at some point, and
really locks in.
yeah, and then we know now the transmission
For
process.
sure it's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that that's kind of the complications
Yeah.
that we have.
Yeah.
It's hard to maintain a flexible text. right?
Yeah, of course.
That's-
Right.
So, all right. Okay, some interchange of similar words also did. So I talked about matroselectiones as those consonants added, but also sometimes small changes of words were modified. Okay, then I said at the first century it becomes stabilized.
Yeah.
All right, it's in my mind it's possible to get back before the stabilization of the text or standardization. They don't like that term, but the stabilization of the text. There's and we talked about that in Isaiah 7. We think we can get back before that phrase was added, or in Genesis 14:14. We can get back before that text was added. So that's why we call it a pre-Masoretic text.
Now, when you're saying we get before it, it's kind of like we're really assuming probably what is
now on
the
some
replacement for that word.
on
right?
some of those, like the Dan thing, that one's pretty obvious because
we would know
that it couldn't be called Dan before Dan ever existed. Right. The person, it's named after the person. Well, it doesn't make sense to name a person or a city Dan when there is no Dan who lived. So that one I think is reasonable, and I don't think there's any doubt about it. The ones,
but we don't necessarily know what the word would have been to replace it.
Well,
except whatever the historical name of the town was for that area.
And Joshua tells it's either Leshem or Judges tells us it's Laish. One of those. That one, there's a reason that those make sense, but that's probably about what it was.
Okay.
And remember, I don't even know what language it was in, right? Because initially it was Canaanites that name it Laishim or Lashim or whatever.
Sure, right.
And then it's the Israelites that name it Dan, so I'm not exactly sure. But it seems like in that case, we are pretty sure we can get back to an earlier form that's in the MT.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. So that's why I think some of them are easier than others, like the one about the 50 and 70 men, or 50,000 and 70 men. That's a lot more complicated. I don't think that's going to be as easy to figure out. That one last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, we talked about in Genesis 4:8. There's that phrase that's left out, and Cain said to Abel, his brother, "Let us go out in the field." And then when you're in the field, that phrase, "let us go out in the field," is not there. And yet it does seem like makes sense because it says Cain said to Abel, his brother, and then there's nothing there. So again, that one seems like it's pretty reasonable. It should be in the text.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
What I'm a little nervous about is we're talking about all these changes, but in actual fact, there's very few of them. The reason we can talk about them and know them is because there are not very many of them.
Yeah. So a lot of this has been cataloged and worked on for a long time. And that's part of what we're doing in the podcast is hitting the examples. But there's not a ton of them.
Okay, let's keep going. How do you get back before the stabilization of the text? And here's my example is Genesis 4:8. Cain told Abel his brother, and then it doesn't say what he tells him. All right. The Peshitta, the Vulgate, the Targums, they all have "let us go out in the field," and so it makes sense that it could be added. Now, I do put on here, it is possible to that a scribe added it because it didn't make sense. I don't see a real good reason why a scribe would remove it. Why would they take out what he said? It is possible that maybe a scribe skipped it, there's a phrase and they missed it. That's possible. We've all done that when we were copying something. We've gone back to the wrong line and we left out something. So that is possible, and I think that's probably what happened, actually. Okay. All right, so it seems necessary to the meaning of the text, so I think it's supposed to be there, and it seems somehow it's fallen out. So that seems to be the most logical answer. But that's how we get back before the pre-Masoretic text. Because remember, it's not in the Masoretic text, but we think it must have originally been there. Okay? All right. The goal of the Old Testament textual critic is to determine the final authoritative form, which was maintained by the scribes and was later recorded in the canon. So in some cases, we can get back before the MT text. I've changed my wording now. I now just call it a proto-MT. That means before the MT.
Yeah.
Okay. The goal of the New Testament textual critic is the recovery of the original reading of the text, or in some cases, may be necessary to identify the earliest possible reading, like in Mark 16. That one, we talked about that as being real complicated.
Yeah.
So maybe we can't get back to the original,
Right.
but we can get back to the oldest that we know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that's the best we can do.
Right,
and then,
right.
And then just realize we're going to have a problem with Mark 16.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
all right. Okay. Just like in the Greek textual criticism, we've got accidental changes
Sure,
and intentional ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Accidental ones are mistakes made by the scribes in the copying
Yeah,
process.
the transmission process.
Yep. And then intentional ones, these are intentionally made by the scribes, thinking they were correcting or alleviating a problem
Yeah,
in the text.
potentially the Dan
Yeah.
thing.
Or even the,
This is clearer if we say it
yeah.
the way people know this city or something
Right.
like that.
Yep. So those are the kind of things. We start with unintentional mistakes. Know the same common mistakes, like we had just like in Greek. There's some letters that are similar.
Yeah.
In Hebrew, that same thing. You can see a cough and a baith
Yeah.
are real similar. There's only a little tittle
Right.
that's difference between them.
Yeah.
And that a tittle is that little sticking out line
Just
on
on
the
right,
bottom.
the bottom right corner
of that
Kind of
baith.
makes it a flat line, basically,
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
bottom of the
Yeah.
radical.
And then homophony would be similar sounding words. Like in Hebrew, there's a real common one. Lo can either be lo as in not or lo as in to him. And it sounds the same,
Yeah.
So
Big change, though.
yeah. On Isaiah 9:3, I think there's one that it's. I don't think it should say, "You shall multiply the nation; you will not increase their gladness."
Right.
That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So I think it's, "You shall multiply the nation; you shall increase to it its gladness, their
Yeah, yeah.
gladness."
Yeah.
And I think that makes more sense.
Yeah.
So, but that's a kind of change that homophony makes.
Yeah. That would be easy.
Yeah. And then ditography could be just having more letters than they're supposed to or more words.
Sure.
Haplography means omission of it. Ditography means
Yeah.
an addition of it.
Yeah.
And both of those are pretty common changes.
It's essentially a misspelling,
Yeah.
really, right? I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
And then metathesis is switching two letters around.
Yeah.
And in
Super
fact,
easy.
in
Yeah.
Hebrew, some places that actually normally happens. Like, there's and it's to help it be sounded. In the Hithpael, you often switch, if the root of the word starts with a shin or an S sound, they'll commonly switch them around because it's easier to say the the S sound before a T sound or something like that.
Yeah.
So those kind of things can happen, and sometimes they're normal changes.
Yeah.
All right. Fusion is an incorrect word division, and fission is putting two together that shouldn't have been. And then we talked about omissions. Second in 1 Samuel 13:1, that how long did Saul reign? And the text doesn't actually say.
Right.
So my guess is at some point it fell out of the
Yeah.
text. And I think we talked about, why would a scribe even say anything about how long Saul reigned if he didn't know?
Right.
So I think it's logical that it was there initially and now it's fallen out.
Right.
So, and even what's interesting on that one is even like the Septuagint and Latin Vulgate and stuff like that, they're no better. They don't help us to know how long he reigned.
Well, in probably a lot of cases, it's just
Yeah.
that's not my job to define it. It's like we're copying as much as we can.
Yeah.
It's probably very rare cases they would try to actually clarify something, because that's that's a lot of responsibility, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's let that go. Now, something that you didn't have in the Greek are vowel changes. So you can actually have vowel changes that actually make two different readings. Like in Genesis 12:3, at the very bottom, "And so you shall be a blessing." Well, one is an imperative, be a blessing, and the other one is a while consecutive on a normal form. So, and you will be a blessing. So it almost makes sense that second one probably is more likely than the imperative. But there's also the idea that when you have you've got a cohortative here, and then another cohortative, and then an imperative is often the way you carry on a cohortative. So I actually believe it probably should be understood to be an imperative, but that the text should be translated more as a future tense. You will be a blessing.
And just for people who are listening can't see it, maybe we should tell a little bit about how vowel pointings even work on a Hebrew word, because there's really not a vowel character. Right?
Yeah, in fact, these pointings that on here, like the consonants are pretty much the square characters on top. The vowel points are what's underneath them or behind them or something like that.
Yeah.
But the Hebrew text didn't have vowel pointings initially.
Right.
And last week we saw that scroll doesn't have any
vowels,
vowel points in it.
Pointings,
So on this one, it's going to be more complicated. And so what you can do is if you can change the vowel points and come up with a reasonable reading, that could be the way you should go on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Where in the Greek, you didn't even have that possibility because the Greek already has the vowels in it.
Yeah, it's a little more like English kind of.
Right.
All the vowels have their own characters and they're a little more stable, I guess, or settled kind of in a way.
Right. So anyway, I just thought I'd add that in.
Yeah.
Okay, intentional mistakes. Scribes occasionally update a text like our Genesis 14:14, changing that name to Dan. The tendency is to include everything rather than to remove something because they consider the text to be sacred, and it's from God, so why remove it?
Yeah.
Changes in spelling or grammar, those kind of things they did that. And I think they were trying to help the reader know what vowels there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the clearing up of other difficulties, that would be like, do you remember we talked about, and Abraham remained standing before the Lord, which initially read, and the Lord remained standing before Abraham.
Right.
But that issue it was always later, it came to mean that the lesser stood before the greater.
Right.
So have the Lord standing before Abraham would be an embarrassment.
Right.
So they switched the names around.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting on that one. It's not changing the meaning at all because initially it didn't have that meaning. The idea of standing before someone
There wasn't a power difference there necessarily, or implied.
Yeah.
Right.
So that one, they're just trying to clear up a problem that was caused because of the grammar.
Yeah.
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 Okay, and then there's harmonizations. Now, the only problem with that is you don't have duplicate text everywhere. So you only have some places where there are places you can check where a text has two different...
It's like directly referencing
quoted.
another...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, then euphemistic changes. You've got those kind of things to like that would be the Genesis thing. Or here,
right.
I guess I put that under theological changes. So Abraham standing before Abraham, or God standing before Abraham thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so it didn't change the meaning; it just changed the ideas to make sure it wasn't an embarrassment. Yeah,
because it's almost if they didn't change it, a person could get an incorrect theological understanding because of like maybe a more modern cultural meaning that had been attached to that phrase or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Okay, there's also additions and glosses. Like in Genesis 6:17, it actually says in the Hebrew that I myself am going to send the flood. And then behind it, it has water upon the earth. Remember, this is the first time they've ever had a flood. So I actually think they wouldn't have known what a Mabul was. And so what happens is they add the phrase, water upon the earth. And I think that's what's called a gloss.
Kind of defining a definition or something.
And what a gloss does is it explains a word like this.
Yeah.
And so I do believe there's probably additions like that being added.
Yeah, sure.
So, all right. Okay, here's that intentional mistake or intentional change. That's theological. Yeah. All right. We know these two words have been switched in the text because the scribes against tell us, but it's to help us to know it's then to take away an embarrassment.
Yeah.
Okay. Euphemistic changes. Abraham, and the glosses. So we've talked about those now. All right, two types of evidence. We talked about external evidence. That would be evidence from all the versions and things like that. Then internal evidence would be how the book, like what the rest of the book understanding could be, like a change in reading, so how things are spelled or something like that.
Yeah.
So we still have the two kinds of evidence even in Old Testament textual criticism.
Yeah.
All right. in the history of the Old Testament transmission, there are still a lot of questions, and that's what I wanted to bring those up, because that's another thing you have to add into the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So the first thing, the question is what language were the earliest texts written in?
Yeah.
Remember, the oldest we know that goes back to
Yeah.
Hebrew is like about 900 BC.
Right.
Well, we know that if Moses is writing in the 1400s,
Right.
what language is he using?
Right.
And our guess is it's some kind of Paleo-Semitic, which at least at this point we know goes back to at least 1200 BC,
Yeah.
and probably goes back earlier.
Yeah.
So it would be a related language, and yet it could still have slight differences in it.
Yeah.
because it is
It's
a little
developing
different.
and
Yeah.
of course.
Okay, so that's our first problem. Second one is what script was it in? Probably Paleo-Hebrew, but once again, if there's a Paleo-Semitic, it might have been in that initially. But some of our earliest ones are what we've got here is this one goes back to about 900 BC from Khirbet Qeiyafa, and it's called the Khirbet Qeiyafa inscription. And so this is what's called the Paleo-Hebrew. And then at a certain point, we know after the exile, when they came back, they brought the Assyrian square script with them. And so that's then what it was copied into.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Another question is, were there divisions between the words? I don't know if you can read this, but this one is called the Tel Dan inscription.
Okay.
And it's got the reason this is so important, it's got the house of David. And some people have questioned whether David ever existed.
Sure, yeah.
This one's pretty clear. But if you can see those circles that I have there, each one of those has a little point in there, a dot, indicating that two words are separated.
I see. Yeah, it's like a space almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not all the places have it. In fact, this House of David
doesn't have it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It could be this doesn't have it because it's a construct relationship. House of David.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, but you can definitely see dots in some of these, and other places they're not.
Yeah.
So that's another question.
Yeah.
And that might make significant difference. Like in Amos 6:12, do horses run on rocks? Well, no, they can't, or they shouldn't, or they'll slip and fall, right? Okay. Or does one plow them with oxen? Well, that one's yes.
Yeah.
So you're reading you're translating the same passage, but one has a positive answer. The next one has a negative.
Yeah.
Okay. So yet you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of the righteous into wormwood. It sounds like you should have two negative statements, especially with that next phrase, right? So we think what happened is that maybe the first one talks about, do horses run on rocky crags? Okay. But the next one maybe should read, does one plow the sea with oxen?
Definitely not.
And the reason you wouldn't do that, so all you'd have to do to change that reading would to put a break between the last two letters on that word.
Wow.
Yeah, and oxen is usually a collective noun, so you wouldn't usually make it plural. But if you see horses, that's how you make it plural, is put a plural ending on it. Yeah. So they might have thought that you needed a plural ending on the word oxen, even though it's a collective and you won't need it on it.
Right.
So there is a reasonable explanation as to how this one might have come in.
Yeah.
So, and I think once again, this one makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
All right. What were they written on? Papyrus, as far as we know, goes at least back to about 2000 BC and maybe further. Stone, biblical text talks about, remember the Ten Commandments, tablets of stone.
True. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then scrolls, not codexes, but scrolls go back to, once again, we don't know, but papyrus scrolls could have been quite early also. It does say to write things in a book, and it does seem to be a sefer, which suggests the book and not on some kind of stone anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So now codexes didn't come about until the 2nd century AD. So we know the Hebrew texts weren't written on those.
Yeah.
And in fact, from what we can tell, the Christians were the first ones to use those. Yeah. So that's kind of neat. And then clay is another possibility, because clay is real common to make clay tablets back then.
Oh, sure. Right.
So that could be another possibility.
Yeah.
So, who maintained them? Priests, scribes, Levites. We've got Exodus say, write this in a book, and it does sound like it's a codex kind of thing,
Right.
Or a scroll kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then Daniel says, in the first year of my reign, I observed in the books, and he was at least talking about Jeremiah at that point.
Yeah.
So we know that they must have written on something. I thought this would be an interesting thing. This is what's called a boundary stone.
Okay.
I just got an email asking, what is a boundary stone? Why does Proverbs keep talking about don't move the boundary stones? And my response to that is that moving boundary stones was like stealing land. And a lot of times you could never tell that somebody had moved your boundary stone.
Right.
So it was like stealing your land and nobody else could catch you, but God could. And that's why Proverbs keeps mentioning, don't do this because I'm the avenger of that.
And so boundary stone would be like kind of, you set them on the corners basically of your property or something?
Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
And anytime you moved them, you'd be actually stealing land.
Yeah. It's very it's pretty this one you have, this example is pretty intricately carved.
And what it does is it has the gods represented on the top and then the curses down here for
like
moving
if you
it.
touch it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
All right. And then when was the Old Testament canon complete? Most people say about 300 BC. Malachi was written about 400 BC and Chronicles about 400. So once you've got all these complete, now you can put them into a group of them or a canon, we call it.
Yeah.
So I think that makes some sense anyway.
Yeah.
Here's a picture of the Isaiah scroll, and you can see how the Hebrew was written.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and you could also see it didn't have any vowel points.
Yeah, it doesn't, right.
Yeah. All right. This is my best representation of how to explain the different versions that are going to come from this. Like the Samaritan Pentateuch is the Pentateuch written in Sumerian.
Yeah.
And it was Samaritan, not Sumerian. Samaritan, and it goes back to about the 200 BC, and it's in a totally different script than the Hebrew. And there are some theological modifications in it. I think there's about 6,000 changes between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Hebrew. Now, 6,000, that's scattered over all 5 books.
Yeah.
Okay?
Still seems like a lot.
And some of them could just be as minor as a vowel change.
Yeah.
So so some are minor, but some are theological. Like in Deuteronomy, I think it's 6. I can't remember the exact reference where it actually says that where I'm going to cause my you'll take the ark with you until you come to the place where I cause my name to dwell.
Yeah.
And we know that that's going to be Jerusalem, right? In the Samaritan Pentateuch, it actually says that that's Mount Gerizim because that was their place that they said. So there are theological changes too.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that's basically a repetition, but there are some theological changes.
Yeah.
So we call that resignification. But most of it, I would actually say, is just repetition. They're just a copying of the Torah.
Yeah.
Okay. The Septuagint. That's about 250 to 150 BC. And I would actually say that most of that is repetition, but some of it is resignification because there are, like in the book of Jeremiah.
Right.
Jeremiah, the Septuagint is like a 6 shorter than the Hebrew.
Really?
Yeah. So is it intentional? Was it intentionally reduced? I think there's good possibility that could be what's happening. But some people have argued, no, the Septuagint is the original, and the Hebrew is the one that was expanded from it.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
That's tough.
That one seems less likely to me, but some have suggested that.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Some have even said that both of them were inspired. A guy named Holiday argued that the shorter one. Do you remember when Jehoiakim Baruch read the scroll to him, and as he read it, he cut it and threw it into the fire?
Right.
In Jeremiah, it tells us about that. Well, Holiday argued that the shorter one was the first one was written, and then because he then says, so Jeremiah added even more curses to it, or more words to it. So he argues that the Hebrew is the longer one. Yeah.
Wow.
I doubt that that's true, but
It's clever.
It is clever. Maybe too clever. I don't know.
Right.
All right. For the Qumran manuscripts, they're anywhere from 350 BC to 100 AD.
Yeah.
So again, some of those are just a mere repetition.
Yeah.
Some are very clear. Some of them are a modification, and we call it resignification. So they're adding things to it.
Yeah.
Like one that would be a pretty good one on that are what are called the commentaries. There's something called the Habakkuk commentary, and it'll give a little of the Hebrew text, and then it'll explain what it means.
Wow.
So the resignification is then trying to explain in the current. What it does is it tries to take the current time period and explain it against that history. Yeah, so it's definitely resignification of that.
And that was found with the Qumran.
Yeah, that was found
that's
in
it.
Qumran. Yeah,
Like in the discovery.
I think I told you the last time, but that the oldest manuscript that we know from Qumran just has holes in the papyrus because the ink has eaten through all the way through. Because there's a little acid in what the inks were made of, and it has eaten all the way through it.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of neat, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, then about 100 AD, there were some manuscripts found at a place called Marabat, and those ones are the ones that are almost exactly the same as the MT. They haven't changed almost at all.
So is this one of the indicators that
Yes.
it kind of stabilized?
Yeah,
Stabilized was
and,
the term.
And remember, so some of the Qumrans are resignification or adding things to it, but these ones are clearly not just repetition.
Yeah.
Yep. And then there's going to be Greek translations. There's
Outside of the Septuagint.
one is called Theodotion, one is called Semiticus. So there's other copies of it, and they're a little significantly different too. So, yeah. And then there's other versions like the Latin Vulgate. But I think what I'm trying to show in this branch here is that there was a core of Hebrew text that the scribes maintained all the way along, and their job was just to repeat it.
Right.
Okay. Now, remember, up to about 100 AD, right? Because they were still adding matras lectiones or little changes like that, like Dan, the name Dan and stuff like that. Those kind of changes were being made. But after 100 AD, those don't seem to be made at all. No more matras lectiones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it is interesting, but the vast majority are going to be along this branch.
Yeah.
But there will be some that are resignification of stuff.
Right.
So that's why I've got that picture there
Yeah.
to help us. All right. These are just the various things that we got. Across the top, I've got who was maintaining the text. Notice that the Masoretes were about 500 to 1,000 BC, or I'm sorry, AD. And the vowel points were started to be added at that time. So that's, as you can see, that's quite late to the text.
Yeah.
Qumran discoveries are...
Can I ask you about that?
Sure.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Vowel points being added, but that doesn't really seem to affect the idea of the text being stabilized.
No.
Because that's kind of just...
Once again, I think
it's implicit in what...
I think what was happening is the Hebrew people were losing their ability to read and stuff like that. So I think those Masoretes were trying to help them. Have how does this read? And unpointed text can read a variety of ways.
Sure,
sometimes.
right.
So
right.
Yeah. And then you've got Qumran manuscripts. Then you've got our Aramaic Targums that help us. Remember, I think I told you about the Cairo Geniza, where the Cairo synagogue in the 1900s was being remodeled, and they found all these manuscripts in a Geniza, which means hidden place. So that was another major find. And then here's what I tried to do is give you some clues on where the manuscripts or primary translations come in. So you've got silver amulets that are dated about 700 BC or a little after that, which is a portion of the Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. They're on silver, and they're actually stored in the Israeli Museum.
Which is why they lasted this long, I'm sure. Right.
In the silver, And then the MT, we date that up to about 250 to 200. Samaritan Pentateuch about 200. I've got the letter of Aristeas in there that seems to try to tell where the Septuagint came from. And if it's correct, that would be a date for the Septuagint.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then we talked about it being unified or stabilized at about 100. Then you've got P52, which is somewhere in the middle 100. Origen's Hexapla. P52 is a New Testament manuscript. Sorry.
Oh.
And then Origen's Hexapla. What that was he was actually doing textual criticism on the manuscripts that he had. So he actually had the Hebrew. He would have the Greek, and he had multiple Greek manuscripts because, like, he had the Theodotion and Semiticus. So he had multiple ones of that, and then he had a Latin translation and stuff. Yeah, so he was basically comparing these
texts.
Yeah, even at that early time.
Wow.
So about 240 he was doing that.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And then we've got Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. That's the New Testament ones. And then these Codex Kyrensis and Aleppo Codex and Codex Leningradensis. Those are Hebrew manuscripts.
Yeah.
Okay?
And that gets us into 10th century.
Yeah.
What it looks like, right?
Yeah. And then we've got all these down here that are Greek translations. So Aquila and Theodotion and Semiticus.
Yeah.
And then so those can be helpful at times. Okay, so that's basically a big overview of what the evidence is.
Yeah.
All right. Masoretic notation. Though these scribes appear to have inherited a unified text, they had questions regarding some of the readings. Like remember the nun up above the line? That'll be one of them.
Yeah.
All right. As we noted above, scribes of this period had both tendency to preserve the text as well as to revise it, but only if they let you know that, and were very careful not to do much of that once it was unified. However, the ability to revise it was greatly hampered after it was unified. Thus, they developed special notations or indications when a text is questioned. I want to show you some of those.
Okay.
And they did it without changing the consonantal text as much as possible.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Exactly when these notations were added is still unknown. Okay. All right. Here's one that's called a perpetual chore. It's a kathiv and chore. Kathiv means what is written.
Okay.
Chore means what is supposed to be read. So they can read it. They have the text itself, but they can put different vowel points on it so that you know it's supposed to be read a different way. Yeah. This may be a good example to help you. But people think there's anywhere from 800 to 1,500 kathiv and chores in there. Okay. On the word Yahweh are those 4 letters there.
Yeah.
A perpetual chore means always do that. Is every time you come across those, you would put the vowel points for the word Adonai on it, and that's how you get this combination here.
Yeah.
That's interesting because if you spelled that out, that would be Jehovah.
Right.
And we know that that's a made-up word. So the Jehovah's Witness that argue that they know the real name for God, it's obviously wrong because in Hebrew, notice I've got a vowel on a vowel, and that can't happen. So I've circled that.
It breaks the rules of Hebrew, basically.
Yeah. And now the second one is actually interesting, and you may not have known about this. If you want to, if you have the Tetragrammaton and you want to say the name God, Elohim, you change the vowel on the bottom to a Hirik.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So you're taking the vowel points from the name God.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So at different points, you'll see those perpetual chores.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's one change. Some of them, like Numbers 339a, has dots above letters. From what we can tell from Qumran and stuff like that, those dots above letters means that those words are questioned. This has got some reason, some logical to it. This says, all the numbered men of the Levites whom Moses and Aaron numbered according to the mouth of the Lord by their families, every male from a month old and upwards were 22,000. Okay. Now, the scribes apparently question whether Aaron helped at all.
Right.
And the reason is because in verses 16 and 42, it states that Moses did it and not mentioning Aaron.
Right.
So this is the only verse that actually mentions Aaron helping him.
Right.
So they think that that's questionable whether he's actually helped him.
And those dots above, those pretty distinguishable from like we looked when we looked at the actual scroll.
Yes.
There's decorative.
Yeah.
They're kind of lines, but they kind of culminate in a dot. They're
Yeah,
pretty,
those were tagim, remember?
Yeah. But those are easily distingushable.
Yes, these are clearly dots.
Yeah. Okay.
I wish, now that you said that, I should have brought the Hebrew. Sorry. All right, then we've got that suspended letters.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I told you about that one, but there's actually more than that, too.
Yeah, this is the Manasseh one.
Yeah. There are inverted nuns, like in that happens 9 times in the MT. 9 times the inverted nuns occur in the MT before Numbers 10:39 and after Numbers 10:36. So the question is, some people have at least, and again they note this in the margins. It's telling us that they think those are verses are to be switched around. Yeah, it's possible. I don't know that that's necessary, but that's what those nuns, I think, are to tell us.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. There's some letters that are large in the manuscripts, like Genesis. I think we saw that, right?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Where we had the Beth on Genesis really big.
Right.
At this point, we don't know exactly what some of those are for. I hope we can figure them out one of these days.
Yeah.
Like some of them are like the middle letter of the Pentateuch. So like Leviticus 11, 42, that actually is big because it's the middle letter of the Pentateuch.
It's amazing.
And the middle verse of the Pentateuch has a large gimel in there. And once again, those ones are told us. So that's how we know those.
Yeah.
These other ones, some of them are not told us.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah. All right. These are Sabirin. There's 70 to 200 of them in the MT. These are places where the manuscript, Tove says actually maybe about 200, and Ginsburg thought 350. So there's some question that indicated by the word Sabrin. So in the margin, the word Sabrin is there, which means that is supposed. So they actually put Sabrin there, in the marginal notes, and Tove states that the Masoretic terminology is therefore, well, he actually explains, it has been suggested wrongly. He thinks these are
It's a negative.
Are wrong choices.
Right.
Sabrin indicate words or forms of words that appear difficult in the context are nevertheless correct and should not be changed. So it's like in Genesis 19:8, the spelling on these is not the normal spelling.
Right.
So the Sabrin would be to have the normal spelling, and yet what Tove thinks means is that, but you leave it the way it is.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Jeremiah 48 has, this one is the word fire goes forth is what's happening there. And fire is thought to be a feminine noun, so they think it's spelled wrong. So there's a Sabrin that has the different...
The feminine spelling.
Yeah.
Right.
But if Tove is right, he's actually arguing, but you shouldn't change it. You should leave it that way.
What's the reasoning for that? Leave it because that's how it has appeared for...
I think the reason is that what he would say is that there are places where when the noun comes after the verb comes after the noun, it stays the normal form and doesn't modify to it. And there are a couple examples that he might be right. So it could be that you wouldn't change it to the feminine, but it's just because of the order of the way it's written.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Correction by the scribes. Those are sophim, are what they basically are. These are at least 18 of these corrections in the MT that remove words the scribe considered objectionable, like our Genesis 8:22, where they switch it.
Yeah.
So I've given an example on that one, but we've already talked about that.
Yeah.
All right. Scribal omissions. There are 5 places where Babylonian Talmud actually mentions 5 places where a wow has been left off a word. What's funny is it's almost always on the word one. 4 times it's on the word one, and only once on your judgments.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if they're correct or not, because in poetry, like in this second one, in poetry you often don't have the wows added. It's a poetic. Often doesn't have it or need it.
Yeah.
So the question is it right or not?
Right.
I thought this would be funny. This is the Habakkuk commentary. You can hopefully you can see you're reading along its normal Hebrew square script.
Yeah.
We get to this where that box is.
It's diagonal.
That's Paleo Hebrew. Wow. So when it got to the name Yahweh, it actually put it in Paleo Hebrew.
Interesting.
So
another kind of indicator, probably not to say this word, right?
And probably also to a sign of respect. So put it in its older
Original
text, not
form almost.
not in a more modern script.
It's very different looking.
Yeah.
You can't see it if you're just listening. It's pretty.
Yeah.
It's almost like a 45 degree, where most of Hebrew is kind of like
square,
90
yeah.
degree. Yeah, it's like lots of flat.
Yeah.
And straight up. This is about 45 degree angle for a lot of the lines.
Yeah. So I thought that'd be fun to see.
Yeah.
These are corrections in the Isaiah scroll. That's funny. Do you see the dots under this one?
Yeah.
Dots under here, and then dots under that one. And the first one is a change from Adonai to Yahweh, and this one is a change just opposite. So you have Yahweh Adonai in the text, and they Yahweh in the text, and they change it to Adonai. So it's interesting. The changes are just exactly opposite.
It's like they're replacing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, okay. So I assume what that means is they had a manuscript that had these different
reversed
readings in it,
Yeah.
and so they switched them.
Wow.
And then noted it by putting those dots under it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that's interesting. Another thing that's interesting is they often have a colophon after Deuteronomy, and a colophon is like a conclusion or and basically it's a summary of what is in the Pentateuch. So it has a total number of verses which are to the book. That would be Deuteronomy, is 955. The middle of it, and it even is Deuteronomy 17:10, so it tells you where the middle phrase is.
Yeah.
The number of Sederim, I spelled that wrong, sorry. Sederim and divisions are 31. The total number of verses in the Torah, so now it's going to the whole Torah, is 5,845. The number of Sederim in the Torah is 176. Sederim are how the book was divided, so they could had reading, how much to read each time.
Yeah.
It even goes the total number of words in the Torah, 79,856. And then it even has the total number of letters in the Torah.
Wow.
Yeah, and 400,945. So we assume, and we're pretty sure, the reason for this was that they could go through now and check. So if you counted the letters and it wasn't 400,000, you've made a mistake somewhere.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And the total number of words, same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and remember, that's what the Masorete's job is to make sure they had an accurate text.
Yeah.
So this is one of the ways they could do it.
Confirm that.
Yeah.
Or to indicate if there's an issue at least.
Right. Okay, now we're getting into how to do textual criticism in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
First thing I need to let you know is this is the actual Hebrew Bible here. And on the side, there's something called the Little Masorah. And what it is, I see my red circle on the very top one, that's a circulus. That circulus is telling me that phrase, the vision of Isaiah, that and when it's between it means boast, that whole phrase. And sometimes I've seen 3 dots, so it can mean that whole phrase in there. But between it, if it's right above it, it's telling us that word. Yeah. Okay. So the circulus here is saying, and you go over to the side and it says there is not. So there's a lamed with a dot above it. That means there is not. So that means that's the only time that phrase occurs exactly that format.
Wow.
Yeah. Now it's interesting. Notice there's a little 1 by the lamed. If you go down to the bottom of the page, it will say there's a 1 down there, chapter 1, verse 1, and 1 with a "b" on it. So it has the same reading, but has in the vision of Isaiah.
Right.
And it tells you it's in Chronicles 32,
Right.
32.
Right.
So what you've got here is you've got a really, really detailed,
Yeah.
almost like a lexicon.
Yeah.
And that's what this bottom thing is. I don't know if you can, do you see the MM?
Yeah.
MM means Magna Masora. Magna Masora is a book. All it is a list of or it's a book of lists, and it's got all of these in it. So each list is numbered, and so if you go to Magna Masora number 200 or 2203, you will find on the second one you'll find the places where it has 3 times the word. The name is Hezekiah, and it's written. It tells you 3 times in the prophets, it's written like this, and in Chronicles, and in 2 times are pline, and 1 time is defective. So what that means is there's a letter fallen out, like back to the matris lectionis. In Hebrew, you'd actually don't need that consonant. You can just put the point, and you'll know that it's a certain vowel.
Yeah.
So what it's telling us is you can go to that list in Magna Masora, and it'll show you all the places where that occurs.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Reference material, essentially.
Yeah. So I
Wow.
think it's really neat.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what you've got there.
Yeah.
All right. Now, that's not even talking about textual criticism yet. So, so when I got down, the first one we have is in verse 4, and it's where, do you see the A before this letter and the A behind it? That means that phrase. Okay, so over or down in the bottom, it'll tell us that phrase is greater than in the Septuagint. So that means that the Septuagint doesn't have that phrase. Yeah. So again, what it'll do, the textual notes will evaluate it, given you the other manuscripts or versions that are out there.
Right.
So that's why it's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, that's what it says. Here's it. They have turned away from God. So that's what that phrase is, and it doesn't have it in the Septuagint.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's how you read it. It's got all those abbreviations, but those abbreviations mean something.
Yeah.
And in the front of the Hebrew Bible, you can look and it tells you what all those abbreviations mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'll show you one more. This was in verse 7. You see the A behind it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so down on the very bottom of the page at 7a, and that lamed, or that L means read Sodom. Sodom is Sodom. But up here it means strangers. So the question is, so here it is. Your land is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your fields, strangers are devouring them in your presence. Its desolation was overthrown by strangers. Okay, that they think that sounds wrong. So what they do, and it has like the destruction. So how they would translate it is desolation like the destruction of Sodom. Oh. So it does make sense, and so they think reading it like that would be a better reading.
Right.
And later on in this text or in this chapter, it does talk about Sodom, you people of Sodom and you people of Gomorrah.
Right.
So it's very possible that it could be a change.
Yeah.
Now, that change is significant. You can see the vowel pointing is different and the consonants.
Yeah.
On something like that, I would probably question whether that's right. That's an awful lot of changes to make.
Right.
For no real reason. It makes perfect sense as it is. It's devoured by strangers.
There's sense in that.
Yeah.
And
my
it's
guess
not like
is
it has no meaning or something.
right. My guess is it's the Assyrians have come in and destroyed the land. So So it does make sense. They would be considered strangers or foreigners.
And it doesn't necessarily fit in one of those categories with it's not like a homophone or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think I have one more. Yeah, I did one more. Okay. This one, I wanted to show you just how minor it is. The only difference between the one in chapter 8 with that A and the one that's in the notes is that it has an and at the beginning. Yeah, and so it's got Isaiah, the Isaiah scroll has it, Septuagint, Syriac, Latin Vulgate, all suggest it should have an and at the beginning. Okay? My guess is it's poetry, so it really doesn't matter whether it's there or not.
Right.
But I just wanted you to see some of them are so minor,
Yeah.
and yet they're still trying
They're
to help
marking
you.
it. Yeah, they want to show it.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's why I did that last one.
Yeah.
All right, so now we've got we've got internal or external evidence. We were looking at different manuscripts and stuff like that. We also have internal evidence. That's what
Sure,
comes
yeah.
from in the text.
Yeah.
And these are using those rules or guidelines, not real rules.
Yeah.
Virgins must be weighed, not counted. And this even
Oh,
works.
right.
It even works in the Hebrew because, like the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, seem to be a related manuscript or translation.
Yeah.
At least they seem to have looked at the Septuagint as they were
Sure.
making it.
Yeah.
So if that's true, you can't count those as two separate witnesses because they're related.
Oh, right.
They're really only one witness.
Right.
Okay, so that helps us. Number two, the shorter reading is generally preferred.
Sure.
And the reason is because scribes usually add, not subtract.
Yeah.
Okay. Number three, determining the reading that would most likely give rise to the others, if that is possible.
Okay.
If there's a plausible reason why one variant could give rise to the other, we at least should consider that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then number four, determine which reading is most appropriate in context.
Of course, right.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then number five, examine parallel passages. That would
If they
make sense.
exist, right,
Yeah,
yeah.
if they exist. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the guidelines we
steps.
use.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, here's our summary. Textual criticism is crucial for determining the most plausible original reading of the text.
Yeah.
That's our goal.
Yeah.
So if we have a goal, that's it.
Yeah.
All right. We're in a better position today than we've ever been in to be able to do this.
Yeah.
The reason is like we found the Qumran manuscripts,
Yeah.
and that was only like 75 years ago.
Yeah.
We've found other Greek manuscripts and stuff like that. So we are better now prepared to do that than we've
Yeah.
ever been.
Yeah.
Okay. Our goal is to determine the most likely original reading of the text.
Yeah.
And that's both in Hebrew and in Greek.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, and that's a really critical step
Yeah.
there because, like, I think in the first episode we talked about textual criticism in general. We really connected it to the idea of inerrancy.
Yes.
So could you walk through that again for us?
Yeah, well, again, it would be the same in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
If we don't know what the text is, we don't know if it's inerrant or not.
Right.
So our first job is to see what we think the text should be, and then the second step would be, okay, is it inerrant or not? And
Right.
and our logic is that if it's really from God, and if this text comes from God, then it can't have errors in it. It
Right.
has to. So if there's errors in it, they had to come in the transmission process.
Right.
And that, I think, makes some sense.
Yeah.
Do you see how this is different than the Greek?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
so I wanted to, in one sense, kind of compare them.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some
Right, right.
differences because of how it happened, how we got the text.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even just what we have of it today.
Yeah.
It's a totally different. We have less of it, but it's of exceedingly high quality.
Yeah.
That's a really different way of thinking of how do you assemble this and compare. It's
Right.
very different.
And that'll also now help us. What I also wanted to do is try to show how careful the scribes were and the counting of the letters and stuff
Yeah.
like that, so that you would know these guys did a good job. They were meticulous at trying
Right.
to make sure the text is
Right.
correct. But sometimes there are oddities in the text or things that we wonder about. Sometimes they're as minor as adding an and to it.
Yeah.
But other times they could be a difference, like switching the words around, like switching Yahweh and Abraham around, so it doesn't cause a theological problem.
Yeah, sure.
So there's all kinds of things that can happen.
Well, and even I think the example too of the oxen and the sea, that's a really good one where just a space.
Yeah.
Knowing that this, there could be a space between these characters that really changes it. And now all of a sudden, like the metaphor locks in.
Yeah.
Okay, this makes sense.
Yep.
The construction here totally makes sense.
And actually, we know that in the Qumran time, the vavs and the yods are really hard sometimes to distinguish. So on that one, it may not be that kind of an issue, but
Right.
we know that sometimes these letters are very close together, and it's hard to know if they're two words or one.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's very good.
yeah,
It's really good stuff. It's a lot, but I think it's really helpful. And again, like we've talked before too, we want it to this is an important part of how we get to English
Yes, translation.
translations and how people understand it. And so there's a lot of thinking that goes into this. But I think it all kind of leans back into we can have confidence in the text we have in our hands.
That's our goal. Our goal is to find out what the original text was to the best of our ability.
Yeah.
And then to figure out what it means.
Yeah. That's perfect. Okay. Well, that sounds really good. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Wegner.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.